groups. From that point forward, the South became known as the, quote, solid Democratic South. Southern state legislatures were again solidly in the hands of Democrats, and white supremacy in the South was reestablished. By the way, recall Representative Josiah Walls? It was during this same contested election in Florida that the Democrats had challenged his credentials for the second time, and that the democratically controlled House had sent him home. He had survived the first challenge when Republicans were in charge, but when sent home this second time, with the state back in the hands of Democrats as a result of the Great Compromise, Walls was therefore defeated by white Democrats, thus ending his congressional career. Eventually, all remaining black legislators in the other Southern Democratic states were also defeated and removed from Congress. Democrats thus succeeded in barring Southern blacks from federal elective offices for an additional 70 years. Returning to 1876, public debate began to focus on issues that had already been raised in earlier civil rights laws. Laws and issues that Democrats were now trying to reverse. Issues such as education. For example, this piece, entitled Politics and the School Question, Attitude of the Republican and Democratic Parties in 1876, examined the contrasting positions of the two parties on the issue of education. The Republicans had supported public education for all children, regardless of race, but Democrats not only opposed public education for all children, but in fact strongly supported segregated education. For example, this is a published and widely distributed pro-segregation speech by Democratic Congressman James Harper of North Carolina. Notice its title, Separate Schools for Whites and Colored with Equal Advantages. Mixed schools? Never. Similarly, in 1875, the Democratic Executive Committee of Ohio issued this piece on public education to, as they said, expose the tricks of the Republican Executive Committee. What were the so-called dirty tricks of Republicans to which Democrats objected? And what was intended to be an insult about Republicans?
The only positive action of the Republican Party on the school question in Ohio is to destroy the system by requiring that whites and blacks be educated together.
The Democratic response against open education for black youth sometimes went beyond words to acts of violence, such as when they burned down 8 schools in Memphis in which black youth were being taught. Additionally, since churches in the South frequently provided education for youth, such as St. Philip's Church in Richmond, churches were also frequently burned down. And this is a flyer distributed by the Klan in North Carolina showing a school teacher being stripped and beaten. That flyer, distributed to teachers, warned, Miss Whoever, we send you a picture of the way we treated a Yankee schoolma'am in this county last year. Beware lest you share the same fate. The evidences of the widespread Democratic opposition to equal education for black youth are numerous and abundant, and black Americans knew how important a good education was to their own future. As Representative John Roy Lynch had accurately noted,
no educated people can be held in bondage.
And black leaders understood that good education was important not only to black Americans, but also to the future of the country. Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey, speaking on a bill to strengthen the education system for all students, including young black students, wisely reminded the opposing Democrats,
I shall remind the House of one thing more. The youth now springing up to manhood will be the future lawmakers and rulers of our country. That they should be intelligent and thoroughly educated is a prime necessity and of great importance, which is admitted by all and denied by none. All that may be done with this end in view will be returned with an increased interest. I truly hope that those Democrats who oppose this bill will reconsider their opposition and give it their vote when the question shall again be before the House. For one, I shall give it my hearty support, believing it to be just and beneficial in its provisions.
Unfortunately, 87% of the Democrats in Congress at that time voted against that education bill. Segregated, inferior, and dilapidated schools for blacks became the norm in the southern states under Democratic control. In 1954, the Supreme Court and Brown v. Board of Education finally struck down state segregation laws in education, thus reinstating what Republicans had done nearly 75 years earlier in the 1875 Civil Rights Bill. What was the Southern Democratic response to the court decision finally ending segregated education? There was a twofold response, one of words and one of actions. In the category of words, 100 Democrats in Congress, 19 senators, and 81 representatives passed the Southern Manifesto denouncing the court's decision to end segregation. Those 100 Democrats declared in 1956 that desegregation was, quote, certain to destroy the system of public education, and that there would be what they called an explosive and dangerous condition created by this decision. Also in the category of words, Democratic Governor Herman Talmadge of Georgia issued a written attack on the court decision and promised that, quote, there will never be mixed schools while I am governor. He even warned of forthcoming bloodshed because of the desegregation decision. Mississippi Democratic Governor James Coleman, when asked in an interview on Meet the Press whether the public schools of Mississippi would ever be integrated, succinctly replied, I would say that a baby born in Mississippi today will never live long enough to see an integrated school. This was typical of what many Southern Democrats did in the category of words. But the Democratic response went beyond words and also included actions. Following the 1954 school desegregation decision, Southern Democratic governors went to extreme lengths to keep the court decision from going into effect. For example, in 1956, Democratic Governor Allen Shivers of Texas deployed the Texas Rangers to keep blacks from entering schools in Mansfield. The following year, 1957, Democratic Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas called out the National Guard to keep black students from entering Central High School in Little Rock. However, Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower quickly intervened and he federalized the Arkansas National Guard to take it away from Governor Faubus. Eisenhower then replaced the Arkansas Guard with 1,200 troops from the elite 101st Airborne Division, ordering them to protect the 9 black students who had chosen to go to Central High. Democrats in the U.S. Senate strongly protested against Eisenhower's actions to protect these black students. Georgia Democratic Governor Marvin Griffin also attacked Eisenhower's actions and promised that as long as he held office, he would, quote, maintain segregation in the schools and the races will not be mixed come hell or high water, end quote. To prepare for the possibility that Eisenhower might do in Georgia what he had done in Arkansas, legislation was introduced in the democratically controlled Georgia legislature so that if desegregation was attempted, the public schools of the state would be dissolved and replaced with state-run private schools so that blacks could be excluded. These types of schools became known as segregation academies. Meanwhile, in Arkansas, Democratic Governor Faubus, unable to prevent black students from attending school because of the federal protection they had received, simply shut down the schools for the next year to prevent further attendance. And Virginia Democratic Governor James Almond, like other Southern Democratic governors, also shut down public schools rather than permit black students to attend. In 1960 in Louisiana, where Democratic Governor Jimmy Davis supported segregation, it required 4 federal marshals to accompany little Ruby Bridges so she could attend a public elementary school in New Orleans. When Ruby entered that school, every other parent in that school pulled their children out of the school, and for the entire year, little Ruby was the only student in that school building, just Ruby and her school teacher from Boston. So deep-seated was the racism among Southern Democratic leaders that when the 1964 Civil Rights Bill became law, Lester Maddox, who became Democratic Governor of Georgia, sold the fast food business that he owned rather than serve blacks in his restaurant. And in 1960, Mississippi Democratic Governor Hugh White even requested that evangelist Billy Graham segregate his crusades, something Graham refused to do. In fact, when South Carolina Democratic Governor George Timmerman learned that Billy Graham had invited African Americans to a Reformation rally at the South Carolina state capitol, he promptly denied use of the facilities to the evangelist. This type of democratic response against black Americans and the whites who supported them was common across much of the South. And the reasons given by Democratic leaders to justify this disgusting behavior was simply states' rights. The same rhetoric they had used a century earlier, first to justify slavery and the creation of a slaveholding nation, and then to enact laws enforcing segregation and withholding voting rights from black Americans for the next 80 years after the Civil War. During the era of desegregation, in an effort to remake the image of racism so long and so properly associated with the Southern cry of states' rights, Southern leaders began to claim that the Southern Confederate battle flag, the quintessential symbol of a perverted states' rights philosophy, was actually